is one that we will come back to. The fact of one moral principle superseding another. So, every time we have already presented this. We presented this to the InfoWar conference. Patrick was there. Nobody would pay for me to go there. I mean, why would they? But I'm the lead, I'm the guy who leads off here. So I had to do it by Skype. And I hate doing things, by Skype and webinars and speaking into a void and that sort of thing. But, and we've offered it to other people. We've offered it to B-Sides. They haven't said whether or not we're going to be able to present there yet. But anyways, everybody that we have offered this presentation to has the same reaction. That's not legal, is it? Well, that's an open question, maybe. It probably isn't legal in Canada, the way the law is written. Possibly. I'm not sure about that because I'm a little rusty on the current state of the actual wording, but I know that it used to be that anybody who causes a program to run or causes data to be manipulated without color of right, I love that, color of right, good old legal terms, is guilty of an offense. So if you're trying to do active defense on somebody, probably can't do that, so that's probably illegal. But then there's, issues of, is this military, is it an attack, and that sort of thing. So it's kind of interesting. But the fact is, everybody asks the same question because everybody assumes it's not legal. Because everybody thinks this is a really, really bad idea. And I can remember back in 1988. How many of you can remember back in 1988? No, you're lying. You weren't born then. I know that. But in 1988, I had already started doing virus research, and the U.S. Department of Defense came out with a request for proposal for people to weaponize computer viruses. And those of us who were in the research community, the virus research community at the time, all basically said, this is a really, really bad idea. So, like I said, at least 30 years back, the idea of active defense was seen as, this is stupid. Now, various things went on in the interim. For example, Stuxnet. Now, I don't want to say too much about Stuxnet for a couple of reasons. One of them being that Stuxnet really isn't active defense. When we're talking about active defense, we're talking about somebody attacks you, so you attack them back, right? Sometimes called hack back and that sort of thing. Stuxnet doesn't really fit into that category. Stuxnet was a straight, flat-out attack. And they were attacking a physical situation, that sort of thing. But it does point out something that we do need to talk about. And that is, if we're going to do active defense, we got to do it right. And like cryptography, the devil is in the details. It's always the implementation that is the problem. And Stuxnet was an example of somebody doing the implementation properly. Now, they didn't have to have the attribution situation. They already had the intelligence as to attribution, so that wasn't an issue. And it is going to be an issue with active defense. But making sure that you don't damage anybody else, Stuxnet did very, very well. Making sure that it only triggers for the target, the real target, again, Stuxnet, was very, very careful about that. There is a paper by Vessel and Bontchev that was written in the early 90s, I believe, called "Are Good Viruses Still a Bad Idea?" And he goes into a lot of detail there in terms of what you have to do if you're going to create a virus that you intend to be actually a good virus. And, that's definitely, if we're talking about active defense, it should be required reading. So, anyway, currently, a couple of years ago, 2017, the state of Georgia in the United States, they had an active defense bill. And lots and lots and lots of people said to them, this is a really, really bad idea, including Microsoft and Google wrote letters to them taking this as an official position. That bill got vetoed. Last year, basically the same bill was presented to the U.S. Congress. At that time, a website that sort of lists legislation as they come up in Congress said that it had about a 12% chance of succeeding. I haven't checked it regularly to see if it's still there. Even this past week, the Department of Justice, FBI in the United States, has said that they have received, they received a few months ago, permission from U.S. courts to take apart the JONAP botnet, basically from the inside. The JONAP command and control system relies on peer-to-peer servers, and so the FBI set up servers that pretended to be JONAP command and control servers. And so, basically, since it's a remote access Trojan that actually, does the work in the botnet, they could, they could use it to surveil the system itself, to find out information about the people who were running it, to find out all the different infected zombie computers that were a part of it. They could even, in a sense, patch the zombie computers that were a part of it. So, again, under Canadian law, that would not be legal necessarily. However, I know that what they were doing in terms of direct action was limited to computers in the United States, and any computers that they found from outside the United States, they were contacting those governments to inform them. So, right. Now, as I say, it's a really, really bad idea, but some people did take exception to that. There has been a fair amount of research done on active defense in a variety of ways over the years. But as you can see from the titles, sort of, in specialized areas, mostly the military. So, but this brings us to why absolutely everything you know about security is wrong. Okay? The reason that absolutely everything you know about security is wrong is that none of you are more than 70 years old. And for the past 70 years, basically everybody who has been taught computer security, information security, cybersecurity, has been taught the Bastion model. The Bastion model is we build a wall, we are the good guys on the inside, and the bad guys are all on the outside, right? That's the way we think about security. Now, under the Bastion model, if somebody's attacking Patrick, I don't care. As a matter of fact, if somebody's attacking Patrick, I'm happy. Because as long as they're attacking Patrick, they're not attacking me, right? That's the way the Bastion mentality gets you to think. But I started out in virus research. In virus research, you very quickly learn that if Patrick gets infected, my problems increase. I am in more trouble if Patrick is infected. I have to care. And it is to my benefit if I take some steps to ensure that Patrick doesn't get infected. That's definitely not part of the Bastion model. but it is part of security. And it's definitely part of our current security posture. The information environment these days isn't just about one-to-one attacks. It's about malware. It's about viruses. It's about botnets. It's about ransomware. It's about all kinds of these things that don't work well, or that protection doesn't work well in terms of the Bastion model. So you need to change your mind. You need to change the way that you think about security. Again, we're going to come back to this issue of the problems with Bastion mentality in terms of security. Now, we promised you ethics in the title, so we're going to talk about ethics. We're going to talk a little bit about ethics. We're not going to talk a lot about ethics because I have to leave time for Patrick to talk, because he's the one who's got most of the really good stuff. I'm just the warm-up singer, as it were. But yeah, we're going to talk about ethics and a little bit about the theories of ethics here. There's two major divisions. Most theories of ethics fall under two categories. Teleological ethics are the ethics of purpose or goal or objectives. What do you want the end result to be? Utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number, whatever action presents the greatest good for the greatest number. That is an example of teleological ethics. Currently, utilitarianism has sort of given way to consequentialism. If you're really into ethics, you will know what those are. If you're not, don't worry about it. You got the idea. So the other major division is deontological ethics. Most people tend to think that religious ethics, 10 commandments and all that kind of good stuff, lists of rules, these are deontological ethics. These are, you have a duty to do this and not to do that type of thing. And we have examples in professional codes of conduct, codes of ethics, that sort of thing. So ISSA, we have ISSA members, at least one. No, Orvin's a member too. Yeah, so we got at least two. Oh, three. Yep. And ISC2 has a code of ethics. Yeah, okay, so he knows both of them. There you go. And ethics in the internet, RFC 1087. There is also, more recently, the Paris Statement on Trust and Security in Cyberspace, which, thanks to Chet, who's not here, we, as the Vancouver Security SIG, are signatories to. So, statements of conduct. And just as an example, a nice simple example, the ISC2 Code of Ethics, it's only got 4 canons in here. We have a duty to society. We have a duty to, in a sense, ethics itself. We have a duty to our employers. And we have a duty to the profession. So it's a nice, simple, wide-ranging thing. And this principles, it's really funny. Last year, somebody found that for an unknown period of time, the code of ethics on the ISC2 website had been misspelled. So it was like we had a duty to ethical principles, which is sort of like number 2. But anyway, so they fixed that, which is too bad. But okay, now I only use that as an example, because it's nice and simple. But I should point out that the only exam question that I ever submitted to ISC2 that was flatly rejected was on ethics. So, well, anyway, part of the problem that we get into when we're discussing ethics and why we can't agree about ethics is because people have different feelings about where ethics come from. And, nice list here, which I could go through in lots of details, and it's lots of fun to do it. But the point is that most of the time we tend to agree on the broad ethical principles. It's when we get down into the weeds and details that we start fighting about things. And when we get into, holding on to one particular ethical principle at the expense of all others, that's when you get into real trouble. But I should move off of that. So, justifications. Now, this is all kinds of fun. If you listen to interviews with black hats, with the bad guys, with the attackers, none of them ever think they're bad guys. They all think they have done nothing wrong, and they have all kinds of justifications for what they have done. It's just a game. I was only having fun. You hear this over and over again. I'm a law-abiding citizen. I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't murder anybody, even though I, infected an entire hospital with ransomware and 3 people died as a result from lack of treatment. I didn't murder anybody. I didn't steal anything. Actually, it's your fault. Because if you really didn't want me to break in, you should have made it bulletproof, right? It was as easy to break into your system as taking candy from a baby. I don't know where that phrase came from. It couldn't have been from anybody who actually had kids. Have you ever tried to take candy from a baby? Now, again, these guys all think that they are hackers. The descendants of the famous hackers. They think that they are, exploratory and that things, when really, honest to goodness, when you look at what they do, and I had to do a lot of this in researching viruses, most of their stuff is just slavishly derivative and boring. But anyway. And the great one, information wants to be free. They always quote that one, information wants to be free. Look, we all work in security. Part of security is availability, right? And we have to make sure that information, we have to take all kinds of steps to make sure that our systems are resilient, that we have backups, that we, this, that, and the other thing. Honest to goodness, if information wants anything, it wants to be dead. Information wants to be free sounds great, but it really does not work. So, but, in terms of their justifications for what they're doing, I have to give you a justification if I'm going to prove to you that active defense is not a really, really bad idea, right? Okay. How many CISSPs are there in the room? Hands up. Come on, hands up. Okay. I am willing to bet that on the exam, you had some question there that said, what's the best way, what's the most effective, what is it that you really need to determine in order to choose the proper selection of safeguards, countermeasures, controls, whatever. And one of the options, and the one that, if you got the right point, you answered with, is cost-benefit analysis, right? There's all kinds of, we can do threat assessments. We can do risk assessments. We can do business impact analysis. We can do, there's all kinds of other things that go into it. But ultimately, the one that gives us the best information about what safeguards we should choose and implement is cost-benefit analysis. As some people put it, you don't build a $500 fence around a $100 cow. Is it more trouble than it's worth? What is the asset actually worth, and how much effort do we put into the prevent? That's cost benefit. Now, in our current information and communications environment, what is the cost to an attacker of mounting an attack? It depends. If you're a lawyer, right? I will accept it depends from a lawyer, seeing as how lawyers will answer any question with it depends. But no, what's the cost to an attacker these days? Not much. As close to nothing as it's possible to get, really. There is no cost to the attackers. So everybody's out there attacking. Somebody asked me once, several years ago, what should the prison sentence be for somebody who writes and releases a virus? And I said 2 years. And I said it so fast that they said, they kind of looked at me, gee, you've obviously thought this out. What are the calculations that go into that answer? And I said, everybody gets 2 years. At that point, honest to goodness, anybody who had ever been convicted of writing and releasing a virus, infecting whoever, they got 2 years, period. There was just no variation on it. And so, and not many of them, for all the viruses that have been written, there's not many people who have ever been convicted of writing and releasing a virus, even today. And there's millions of them today. So, there is no cost to the attacker. So, we live in a dangerous environment, do we not? I mean, month after month, we have presenters up here, or you go to vendor presentations and you get some vice president or something, and he says, yes, I do see you. He says, we live in a dangerous environment. The internet is a dangerous place. Yeah, it is. Okay.
So summarize, there's no consequences for our attackers, and we're not ethically allowed to counterattack.
Ah. Now there's no cost to the attacker, so we have a moral duty to create a cost for the attackers. We have a duty to society to create a cost for the attackers. If we are going to create the greatest good to the greatest number right now, that would be creating some cost for attackers. Active defense is an ethical good. Active defense is a moral duty. Okay? That's my point for today. Now, it may not be legal yet. Probably isn't in Canada. So we need to address these. Now, there's all kinds of other issues that go along with it. If we are going to do active defense, we'd better do it right. Because if we do it wrong, we are going to create more of a problem than we're trying to solve. But active defense is a moral duty. Ethically, active defense is the right thing to do. And I just promised you the ethics of active defense. I didn't promise you anything about the law. Okay, now, at this point, were I just doing a presentation on ethics, we get into some exercises. This is a really cute one. And we get into case studies, but today you're only interested in one case study, and that is active defense. So, that being the case, what time is it?
2:40.
2:40. I told you he was ex-military.
What's that? No, I said 14:40. I'm going, who knows 14:40?
Yeah.
Switch grades.
So, it's a little bit early to get into the break. So, I'm going to turn it over to Patrick to at least get started on it. before, he can give you his run up to his part of the thing, and then we can take a bit of a break until he gets into the real heavy duty stuff at the back end.
That's it? Are we left? Can we hear back there? Do I need this on? I need it on already. To your question about what's the cost to us, there is a cost. And to the question around robberies, yeah, it's still sort of. There is legal remedies. So background is who I am as America this venture. So this research is one piece of my doctoral research. My research question is very simple. It's find a way to ask us no. He started, by the way. Everybody kept saying no. I can't develop something no. Somebody tells me no, I can't protect people. What are we doing? Where's the social security? Apparently not. It doesn't matter. Oh, does this work? Oh, down here. It's amazing. We got to play with technology. I can break things in 60 seconds or less. Just give me the toy and I'll break it. But the point being, am I allowed to wander? Oh, good. That laser camera can watch us, can't it? But as a social scientist, and it's kind of weird because I apparently now get to call myself a doctor of social sciences because I just graduated from my doctoral studies and successfully defended this thesis. I have presented to federal law enforcement teams around North America. I've presented to corporate intelligence officers in the private sector, and everybody's saying, wow, it's about time somebody did something about this. I'm going, yes, that's the first piece, is trying to figure out what to do. So I take a social sciences point of view. I ask the question, does society back you guys up? And the answer is emphatically yes, which is interesting because the society actually doesn't know what you're asking for. So as IT professionals, has guys working in corporate security to protect information, society itself, the guys you're protecting, don't actually know what active defense means. And yet when you tell them that this is an option open to them, society goes, oh yeah, this is really cool, let's go blow the bad guys up. And that's the language they use, let's go blow the, well, hold on here. We got to get to that stage of a conversation that's grounded in some kind of policy space. So this is about 5 years of research. And it looked at asking, I had one question that was a primary question from industry. This was industry driven, by the way. This was not something I wanted to do. I got involved in this because of another problem. But when someone explained it to me, I went, oh yeah, this is it. There is a problem here that's got to get looked at in a systematically way. And I kept coming back to, and it was kind of funny because I can't write code, guys. If you gave me code to try and survive, I'd probably die. You know, my daughter would be happy to get the insurance policy, but that's not what I was about. That's not what I need to worry about. What I need to worry about is that you guys are really good at writing code and writing policy about software, but society itself doesn't actually know what that relationship is between their personal safety and their fridge and their child in the room and the car and all the interconnectivities of IoT. Society at large thinks this is a benign space. There's some really bad stuff in there that's being connected. But the data shows us like 60% of Canadians don't understand that threat. 60%. That's scary. On top of that, in terms of insurance policies, in terms of financing, it's even worse because insurance is putting the risk directly onto the citizen who's not educated about the threat. So they don't know how to react to this problem of someone beating the crap out of them. The hardest part was when I talked to people, I kept being dragged back into the technical solution. Interestingly enough, these technical solutions are already here apparently. Stuxnet being of course the role model, and I have a pet peeve with that one because it's not what they claim it was. There's some more to it that was led us to believe. But we have this so-called notion of white worms, of worms that are designed to help us. All right, that thing died on the vine. We had this idea of using patching systems to take over botnets. That's still being explored. Now AI stepped into the picture. So as a result, what we're struggling with is how do we move ethics and active defense back into a conversation that the public can understand, because you guys are going to try and get policy to protect it or advance it. By the way, it's happened 3 times. I'll show you what that looks like and why they failed. But the IT profession, you folks, are about to try it one more time. There's a group down in the States that are actively pushing this policy forward. We'll see what that looks like. All right, this is out of Canada. This I love. This report, when it floated out, everybody just read the first 30 pages and forgot to read, I don't know, it was page number 42. So they read the first 40 pages. Page number 41 and 42 actually has the sweet point, from what I could see. And that was, and this is an exact quote. The Nielsen report was asking the question, where should we be going with active defense, or defending networks? How do we manage this problem? How do we manage public safety? And this is the last sentence. Overemphasis on resilience, emergency management, disaster recovery, thus presenting a policy of failure. That's a quote from your profession, not the public, your profession. Then it goes on and says, a starting point or strategy for cyber and critical infrastructure protection, proactive cyber defense should be added. Now that term gets a bit murky for a second. I admit that, okay? I'm not saying it's the correct term. I have a problem with that. But here was the one that went, okay, here we go. Expressly stated by a few participants that the action areas given to them as examples in the workbook were too defensive. And then, of course, the comma, and should instead be more offensive in nature. All right, let's get the gloves on and go beat up the bad guys. Really what this was saying, I talked to one of the gentlemen, he goes, like, why did that come out? And it was, well, we were asking the question is, are we doing enough to protect our data? And the answer is emphatically no. Look at the number of breaches. Yeah, okay, that's actually not a good metric. Breaches don't measure those problems. Those are just reflections of other activities. If we start using breaches as a way to identify the rationale for active defense, it's failing to address a larger picture. Okay, so what does the research say? Well, there's a couple things that took me off guard. When I first heard this conversation, I had met guys who'd been involved in this space, and I went, okay, what do you do? How do you beat the bad guys up? Oh, we're very careful about it. Wrong. Here's what we learned. Mr. Veach is now, everybody knows Mr. Veach? Oh, please look up Mr. Veach. He's a good comedian. And the reason he's a good comedian is because he talks about this notion, this idea of being able to hold the bad guys and impose a cost upon them. And it's this long, slow-tailed cost. So that's one form of deterrence. This was even more fascinating. This is Hexagen. He stopped doing this now, but he was using remote desktop protocols and a couple other things, and he was going after Nigerian print scams and the Windows help desk scam guys. Now he gets caught, and there's some legal ethical problems here. CRTC does not like him. And oh, by the way, now there's the FBI. Probably a couple other federal teams are really nervous because you could be hitting one of their own networks, the Blue Guys Network, as they call it. This last one was more disturbing. This group, it's a survey out of Chicago, and what it was two gentlemen there put together a sensor. It's called the Cybersecurity Index Survey. And what they did is they measure overall levels of concerns that you folks as professionals to qualify to be on this group here in the Fortune 500s. In that sample, there's a group that openly says, I think it's around about 12%, depending on how you read the numbers, openly say, we conduct active defense as a means to feel good. Feel good. I have other ways of feeling good. Going back, this is not one of them, because doing this opens you up to a liability problem. Feel good till the lawyer shows up, and then what happens? The lawyers don't find out. Sure they don't. Okay, and the reason they don't is because this is all clouded. The way they conduct these operations and conduct these strikebacks is that they call them reconnaissance. They go and looking around. Well, as soon as you start to do recon and start grabbing other people's data points, you are engaged in a form of cyber operations that go against the criminal codes, both in the United States, the criminal codes in Canada, and also the criminal codes now in the UK. So you got to be careful here. Finally, this last guy here, this was kind of an intriguing problem. I still don't understand the full details of it, but basically he was trying to grab a bunch of data, and he was hot linking these files, and he was just hot linking, and he started to create this bandwidth problem, and of course the company fails. But the point being is that these were all done by private citizens, except for the bottom left guy in the corner. So we got citizens conducting revenge, corporations conducting revenge, and oh, by the way, if you really want to find how good and well organized the data is for it, there's an intelligence data set, and this is active as of 3 weeks ago. This is called AA 419, Artists Against 419. Artists Against 419 were served a notice by the FBI going, don't do this, because what they were doing was they're putting some bandwidth hogs in there and stealing a bunch of the bandwidth so the host would fail. Well, these guys got smart. What they did is they turned around and said, okay, we'll stop doing that. But they publish once a month every known fake bank IP address and all the services it's offering. So you can ping this site, you can go down, you can download one of these places, they'll give you the data about that fake bank and what they're doing. Now, this is really passive because it still doesn't take the bankers offline. The problem being is that this is as far as the law allows us to go. We can only report it out. All right, where are we at? Well, finding number 2. This is that data, and then that takes us to 3 o'clock. We take a break at 3, right? Right, good. So this is the cool part. This is the part that was kind of disturbing. 30% of the 320 companies that were involved in the Fortune 500s have counterattack capabilities. They have them built into the networks, built into their corporate decision making. Whether they actually pull the trigger or not, that we couldn't determine. From reading the literature and talking to some of the guys who constructed the survey instrument, I couldn't get them to tell me, and rightfully so, they shouldn't be. You know, I'm just some Joe Schmuck down the road doing research and trying to figure out what's going on. They really shouldn't disclose their corporate secrets to me. Although, yes, sir?
Give me an example of what you think a counterattack capability is.
For these guys, I suspect it's probably just something like another kind of a DDoS or some kind of honeypot. They're running something passive just enough to disrupt the attacker and basically create some kind of intelligence about the attacker themselves. Either getting attribution or trying to get to some point where they can serve a legal document to go and hit them shut down. It's not forensically sound from what I can gather. They're not using any kind of download strategy that says I can go to an FBI agent and say, here's your data for your warrant. It seems to be ad hoc.
So just to be explicit, a counterintelligence practice or capability would be included in.
Say again, last? Say again. Oh, sorry. Say again. Say again, last.
Yeah.
I don't think it is.
Oh,
Oh, there we go. Okay. So just to be explicit, you're saying that any counterintelligence capability, program, or practice would be included as a counterattack capability?
No. There's a fine line in there. According to the Senate Arms Committee, this is not debated in Justice, by the way. This is debated in the Senate Arms Committee, U.S. Senate Arms Committee, with Mr. Baker and 2 other gentlemen. If you can read the minutes for it, it's quite intriguing. They're making it very clear that the ability to do reconnaissance is not an attack. It's just the ability, as long as you're not interfering with that network's performance or capabilities, you can do all the recon in the world you want. But the question became, and you can see the tit for tat in the debate, about how far do you go to get inside a network and actually start snooping around. And that's where the Senate pushed back and said, that's illegal. So I can look at your shell, I can look at your corporation, I can snoop around in your portals, or I can snoop around your chat rooms that you've left unsecured. If I don't need a warrant and I don't need a password to get through this thing, I can listen. Now there's, again, the tit for tat, and you can read it through the report. You can see them arguing about this position. Now Mr. Baker takes a very strong position going, no, let's just go in there and just rip everything out of them. Okay, now Mr. Baker's, I keep getting this confused. He's either former legal counsel for Homeland Security, or he was former legal counsel with NSA in consultation with Homeland Security. It's murky when you read his bio. It should be murky. There's an ethics in there that we'll deal with in a few minutes too. So does that help you make sense?
Yeah, I was also thinking in terms of, say, deception technology. You mentioned honeypots. That's what you.
Oh, the honeypot queue. Yeah. So there's a debate. So the ethics in behind that, I'll touch on in a few minutes, where it's not the fact that you've stood up a honeypot. What people kept telling me was, it's not that you've stood it up. It's what you're going to do next. There's nothing stopping us from putting something inside our networks and on top of our networks to watch something attacking us. Next step after that, it's a little bit murky, because there's been some case law that suggests, and this case law reflects society's confusion about how much power you guys, I use the euphemism you folks, not to cluster you all together, but has a profession called ITs. Just so you're aware, nobody in society at large sees you people as normal. I know, it didn't come as a surprise, did it? What they see is that you guys had the ability to use this magical language and structure to define victimization and define data and things that don't make sense to normal people. Someone says example, and here's a key example, and then we'll take the break right here. Here's the key example. Information wants to be free. Okay, I'm a librarian by trade and a heavy weapons recon guy. I did a lot of stuff. When someone says a euphemism like that, they're assigning in human attributes to something that's not real. I defy anybody who had misinformation or misinformation walk through that door. If that's his last name, then we got a problem. But if it's just, information is not an object. It's this thing that amorphous in our mind and ethically creates some problems. Do you want to take a break here? Because it's a good point to take a break now? Or, okay, let's do it right here.
some of these guys don't like it at all, but
Nope.
the management likes it. Hi everyone, we're going to start in 2 minutes if you want to take your seat. Thank you.
So I wasn't sure that the mic was still required when I thought we were still online. No, we managed to get online about 10 minutes into Raw. We're still having technical problems with Slide. At least the camera and the audio is working. So, and I think all of the mics are now working. Yeah. This one's really got 1 bar. 1 bar on battery? Yeah. Or 2. Okay. Pop it, unscrew it, and you'll find batteries. Okay, peeps.
Hi, we'll start again in just a minute. I'm going to, Orvin thankfully gave me some of our external events that had been sent over Slack that I had missed, so I just wanted to let you guys know. So there's B-Side Seattle, February 23rd, for anyone who heads down there. And as the one gentleman mentioned, B-Sides Vancouver is definitely March 18th. CanSec West is March 20th. Northwest Cybersecurity Symposium, April 8th, and we have SANS Seattle Spring 2019 is April 14th. So for anyone who wants to, or if you missed a date, please reach out and I will let you know what date that event is. Anyway, so we'll get started again with the rest of the presentation. Thank you, Patrick, for everything, and I'll hand you the mic.
Okay. I'm looking at the slides going, but maybe make sure I'm on track here. All right. So this idea of these corporations conducting these strikebacks. Speaker? Yeah, so it's interesting to see that they're doing this. So this was out of Black Hat. Again, when this report came out with a grain of salt, we all know there's a so-called stigma attached reputation with these guys. And what was interesting was you actually chased back the quote. It wasn't 180 organizations. What it was is that this person was randomly surveying people in the room who could have been one of those 180, or in fact he could have been surveying 6 people from the same corporation. So there's no absolute validity in the testing. But interesting enough, Homeland Security used this as a quote. Okay, Homeland Security is quoting this as being valid data. It took me 45 minutes to tear it back and find the actual data point and going, wrong. When I pointed this out to Homeland Security at a conference, they went, how'd you find it? 2 clicks. Just had to read the rest of the footnotes. Oh, wow, sorry. Not sorry, you're using this as a quote, fix it. I don't know if they're going to or not. This last one was kind of interesting. This goes back to that sample of the 30% up top. Inside this actual group were 8% of them. And they talked about actually conducting the hackbacks and some of the motivations behind it. What was intriguing is when you look at the data points a little more carefully, you find that there's a group reporting it felt good, but there's another group in that set also reporting it was the right thing to do. And this goes back to what Rob and I have been talking about, that there's a moral obligation here now arising that's not just from a technology point of view, it's actually from what we call, from our social sciences point of view, what they call a social contract. We have a larger obligation now, not just our corporations, but because you're so embedded with a corporation and the government and citizens' controls to access food, clothing, shelter, you guys have a legal mandate. And that has to move away from being a rhetoric conversation to actually doing something about it. All right, so what does it look like? So Rob mentioned this earlier. There's two bills that came out. It's important to understand why these two bills are important. Oh, that's kind of redundant. Important to get into important. Give me more water or more coffee or something else. But there's a piece here that needs to be very careful about, is that when this whole mess started, this is because of the Georgia's election. And there's rumors already circulating around some of the chat rooms that Georgia's electoral system had already been compromised. In fact, it was. There was evidence to support this overwhelmingly, and yet Georgia did nothing about it. The state of Georgia, sorry. So in response to this pressure, Georgia introduces a piece of bill as a state bill. And what was interesting is this legal remedy for excuse. And it's excuse to allow active defense to be conducted within certain confines and restraints. But it must be reported to a federal law enforcement team. In this case, they were going to be either the FBI and or Homeland Security, depending on the nature of the threat. Inside the legislation, there was a slight problem, is there's no guidelines for active defense. It just says it's a legal remedy. It's a concerning point of view because you just can't roll out legislation without some kind of documentation to back it up. I've talked to 2 lawyers to try and get this document and the actual underlying seed notes that went with it. It's not working. So we're going to have to figure out a way to get around that because I want to see what they were actually doing when they wrote that section. Microsoft catches wind of it. This is how active defense gets hijacked by technology. What happened was, and am I indicting technology? Sort of. Because when these two step up to the plate, what happens is Microsoft says, I'll take your jobs away from you and your production factory. So they're blackmailing the state when the state's trying to protect itself. And there's an interest here. We did this with the arms race in the 1960s. Oh yeah, it was called conflicts of interest, and it was called a RICO legislation. This is actual criminal offenses. So why aren't we charging Microsoft criminally for interfering with state authority? And it wasn't interference. Oh, Google did the same thing. In fact, both of them signed the letter together. And what was interesting was how the media reacted to it. Oh, Google must have been right. Wait a minute, didn't we just say Google was too intrusive? Or didn't we just say that Microsoft was too powerful in the market? And yet now they're telling us the state can't act independently of the technological framework. And this is the conundrum that was faced amongst your professions, but where's that line? The bill gets vetoed very, very quickly. In fact, the fanfare behind it was quite intriguing because there was no fanfare. Normally when a bill gets vetoed, it gets pushed out and there's a big outcry. Nothing. There might have been about a dozen articles that said what has happened here, but it died very quickly. What was locked into, though, was this notion that there was this thing called active defense that now enters public consciousness. And now we don't know where we're going. Well, not quite true. The second bill is even more important, and this is the one that's very disturbing because I'm all for this business. Just so you're clear, I'm 100% for active defense. 100%. If you haven't figured it out by now, I am. And the reason being is that we have to have a conversation, and this is where some of us get nervous, is this is the same problem we had with the nuclear weapons proliferation, it's the same problem we had with chemical warfare proliferations, and it's the same problem that we had with minefield warfare, because we're talking about corporations running operations that belong to government. When government pushes back and regulates this process, things become a little bit more safer. And this is going to sound ironic, and I get it. The irony's not lost on me, folks, okay? The idea of managing a battlefield so that you have minimal casualty rates is an important concept in social contracts and in societies running well. When societies run well, they can engage in conflict in a rational, orderly way. We can't do that with technology because there's some irrationality associated with this process. The idea of whack-a-moles, attribution, how far do we go with this thing, how many pieces of Stuxnet do we launch, how many pieces of malware do we launch, it may not even be about that because we can't even get to that conversation. It's an interesting problem. So Mr. Schwartow, I don't know if you know this gentleman or not, Mr. Schwartow started publishing a series of papers in 1999, says, let's just go beat the bad guys up. He was all for it. He's not my mentor, by the way, but when I did meet him, we went, oh, this is so much fun. We had so many different ideas about how to plan this process legally. And what he did is he gave me a whole series of data sets from Australia, from Canada, or from the United States, sorry, and demonstrates just how powerful it was in 1999, 2001, that active defense was already being considered. There was already models to do it, and yet it dies a painful death. And what happens is, on testimony of Mr. Stuart Baker, Mr. Baker comes out and he says this very, very clearly. We cannot defend our way out of this. You can't keep building moats around the castle. This thing of isolation doesn't work. When I did corporate operations to protect IT centers, so I worked in healthcare and other agencies, I always kept saying to the IT guys, I'm not waiting for the bad guy to kick your door down. I'm going to meet him about halfway out in the middle of the street, and by the time I'm finished with him out there, he's not going to want to come on the property. Well, that's just the bad guy beating us up. No, that's your IT people doing it. This is your own internal threat problems. These are issues that are active, not passive. And there's a concept in here in social theory, in social science theory, that says that when we start to be passively defending ourselves, the bad guys always, always win. Oh, I hear a mic somewhere. So feedback loop somewhere. But this is the problem, is that we get this effect. All right, this is, I keep wanting to call him Mr. Jones, it's not. It'll come back to me. But he writes a bill called HR 4036. And 4036 actually makes it into the House of Representatives of the United States. It is on the books. It is being actively considered because the question that he poses is that he asks Mr. Baker to sign on with him. So he's now getting momentum, and I keep asking for the House records. Where's the IT profession in this conversation? I still haven't found you yet. That's just so weird. When we consulted on everything from public safety, national security, healthcare, we brought the professionals on board. So why not in this one? Are we worried about the fact that the technology guys are going to hijack it again and make it a technical problem, not opposed to a public policy problem? All right, as said earlier, Scopus Labs does the monitoring on this. It's only at 12%. This thing will die a painful death. Maybe. There is a possibility here this thing will work, because the sentiment right now in the United States around identity and identity theft, and this is an indictment. This is not me talking. This is what the literature is saying. This is what we're seeing about reports from sectors. Our IT profession has failed us. We are such a vulnerable society right now that we are failing to protect ourselves, so therefore we're going to do it ourselves. And there are vigilante groups now forming. We're watching a few of them right now, how they're forming and what they're doing. Just go look at the Minuteman missile systems and the Minuteman Patriot archetype systems that were produced during the 1960s when the government failed. We're seeing the same group form now. That's not good news. That's something that we want to actually try and avoid. So again, we think if it does fail, it's going to fail because there's going to be not enough evidence to support it. But if it does fail because we can't organize the revenge players, what's going to happen is you're going to see government fail to take on the responsibility, and corporate private citizens will take it on and usurp it away from you guys. You guys will become the victims of your own toolkits. And this is really, really scary, because I sort of like my tools and my toys I get to play with. I like to be able to trust them. But right now, the public sentiment doesn't see that. All right. So, cautious of time here. Yes, sir. Don. Oh, talking stick.
Could you clarify exactly what Microsoft and Google and others, what their argument is against this?
Right. They believe that governments and citizens are too stupid, to put it politely. Microsoft's comments in the letter was, you don't know what you're doing. The role of technology is a sector by itself that has its own unique capabilities. Well, this is what we said during the Manhattan nuclear bomb building days. And I'm drawing these analogies for a reason, not because they're like glamorous and fun to look at. It's because it's exactly what we see over and over and over when a new technology is brought into society. And remember, you guys aren't that old. Well, some of you. Let me rephrase that. There's some old people in this room who might remember the days. But in terms of societies, technology that we know it has technology, has information technology, is relatively new to our memory. Hammers were around from rock days, caveman days. Wheels were a little bit newer. Stoves and ovens are a little bit newer. But the technology we know today, the internet, the cell phones, the laptops, those are only around since Shannon, 1943. Production-wise, we don't see until the 1960s. Mass production influencing societies, 1990s. There are people in this room, a few of us, who remember the black phone on the desk that were rotaries. Yeah. He goes, yeah, I know that one. Yeah, that one too. But how many of the younger folks have actually got a landline in their phone, in their house? Yeah, no. What's a landline? You know, a land that goes, yeah, so it has result, ubiquity now feeds into our position. And what came out of my research, just so you're aware that I was surprised, this whole exercise has been an amazing journey, by the way. I woke up and went, wow, I don't know if I want my phone back anymore. I want to see if I can turn it into a fishing weight. Here's what I learned. Was this funny little problem about ethics, that when you try to transplant technology into an ethics debate around defense systems, it doesn't work. There's an actual problem in ethics itself about to deal with ubiquity. Ethics assumes, and this is something that I touch on much more in the research, there's a deeper conversation in ethics about stability, about this ability to measure our human behavior and performance. Behavior is one thing, performance is another, that ethically derives from 5 things. Maslow says this very clearly. Give me your food, give me your water, give me your clothing, give me your shelter, and you're a happy little camper. But there's generations in this room that actually can't get to their food and their clothing and their shelter until they have technology. And that was a shocker for me, because I just took it for granted. I'm old, I get to do this. I remember cooking and hunting and fishing. Not that old, mind you, okay? But I can remember those things. And I talk to younger people, they're going, really? Really? Oh no, it's on the cell phone. No, it's not. The cell phone's an intermediary to the object. Ethics can't handle that problem. And this is why ethics argues that when the intermediary occurs, it has to look for an alternative space. Which is why when you look at ethics from, say, for example, Socrates or Fruso, a couple other guys, they argue that it's not about the human object anymore. It's going to be about this notion of what's out there. Well, out there was corporal. It was a physical entity. That phone is a physical entity with a bunch of other data attached to it. Data that creates new identities and creates new ways of being and existing that we can't even think about now. So we're going to ask the question, do I want to plug you in as a baby with a genome attached to a blockchain, written to your cell phone, attached to your medical record, attached to your car, your fingerprint, and how far down the rabbit hole do we go? Ethics struggles with, well, I can get you to here, but the rabbit hole of augmented humans, the rabbit hole of augmented threats, is a different puzzle. By the way, we had the same debate with nuclear weapons. We had the same nuclear weapons debate with ethics. Was that it was the first time that ethics had to deal with the real question: do you kill one or kill many? You know, the train argument. You jump the train, drew the track. Well, that was real. It was a figment of conversation up until the nuclear age. And when the nuclear occurred, the guys who were doing ethicists at the time went, "It's real." Now we really have to ask that question and look for answers, not just debate it. Which is what this is about here. Yes?
Well, the answer that debate is reoccurring with self-driving vehicles.
Yes, absolutely.
Same ethics. So what's the AI algorithm going to decide in that same model?
Right, and that came up in the research a few times. What come out so there's 2 people that I really watch carefully now, and encourage you folks to watch them also. One is Dr. Floretti, and this is an odd gentleman. I love this man dearly because he's now talked about something that I've wondered about for a long time, and that is, it's called the Infoborg. It's Floretti's a philosopher, and as a philosopher, what he did is he asked the question was, what happens if I decompose you far enough to just energy and object? And that's an ethical position that was often explored in other positions. And what it meant was that when we talk about ethics, we see you as individual objects that can manage or manipulate societies or objects around you. He goes one step further and says that may not necessarily be true. And in quantum, this is where I lose my mind. After this, I go, I forget it. That's another conversation. I've met a couple gentlemen now just locally who've talked about quantum frameworks that can help us understand ethics. I believe you. One's a mathematician. Can someone explain to me what mathematics works and how that happens? But the other part that's fascinating was not to belittle what he's saying, but what he's getting at is when we have conversations where we don't know what the end state looks like, we stop talking. And this has occurred in a number of models he's looked at. We've done this with terrorists. We've done this online chat rooms. We've done this with human trafficking. We've done it within you guys. Tried to see how far you can take a conversation before you have to stop. And you just start circling around to try and defend yourselves in your position. And it happens very, very quickly in some spaces, sorry. So yeah, the AI thing in the car, that's really caught us, because in AI, the Japan car versus the American car, the Japan car starts to learn to control large peoples, and we'll look at that as the problem, as opposed to road safety. It's a really interesting problem. All right, so what does this all look like? Where does the research take? Where did the research take me? What did it take us? What did we end up doing? It was some of you guys in this room, by the way, who started to clue me into something. So some of you folks don't know who you are, but when you start talking, and you start talking about, well, what are we doing as professions? What are we doing as business? Where are we going? I kept going, where are you going? I really want to know, because the public needs to know. And because of that, what happened was, what you're looking at is the first model that came out of the research, based on ethics, by the way. So ethics says that there's this perimeters and parameters we have to control for. The first one is this idea of a social contract. This is well established. This is Hobbes' old business. This is what everybody talks about. This is where we love government, government loves us, we give them power. Not quite true. I know. We do love government, sort of. But the reality is that that's not what the social contract is anymore. The fact is, government doesn't actually have the ability to influence the power struggles that we've had in the past. Corporations do. And they've been assigned that, and if you'd read, there's a paper by Shane, and there's not just his paper, but there's a couple hundred, but Shane's is the most articulate, where he says that corporations, when they were assigned in the 1860s and the early 1902s, 1904s, were assigned human-like traits. What was left out of the sentence is the next one, which says those traits are only assigned as a reference point. It is not that the corporation is this human entity or human modeling. It's that it has traits that exist in law only, not in reality. Well, within 10 or 15 years of those decisions, the government actually backs out of governing the railroad systems and governing societies at large, and gave it to the corporations as carte blanche responsibilities. So that's the first hitch. But the second part was more intriguing. This is where, so on this piece here, it was easy to find the statistically significant tests. Out of the 8 variables, only 4 load on the social side. In other words, government did not load. Corporations loaded as the most single influencing agent now affecting society's performance. Da-da, no surprise, called Capitalism 101. Communists don't need to worry about this, by the way. They have a totally different way of dealing with technology. Totally different. And you can see it in their structure, you can see it in their language. But on the other side, this was the disturbing one. Because I'm justice and I like to think that we can do good things for people. It didn't happen. What came out was these variables here, inside them, only one of them loaded up statistically. The rest of them died off. Now, why the 4 are up here is because the one that loaded statistically was this notion of commutative. Beat up everybody. Redistribute the power structure so that everybody has the same power capabilities. And if they're all victimized, then every victim has the ability to defend themselves. Well, what the problem is, you can't have this unless these 3 are also enforced. So as a result, when you do active defense, you can't just go and beat the bad guys up like we want to do. We actually have to find legal frameworks that can convince the public it's a good thing to do. And that's what we're stuck at. All right, so what does it look like? Well, the first piece is that it does have to come back to the corporation. Ironically, none of the data suggests law enforcement do it. It was all done by corporations. It will become a corporate policing environment. That's interesting. It has some potential solutions in there. But inside that, though, there were some accountability frameworks that they want to see. And this is coming both from the research I did with these people and also from the data sets I was able to get my hands on about IT professionals and what they think. In that the corporate decision framework, and that gets blown up in the next slide, you'll see what the big piece looks like. It's regardless of whether they activate the triggers or not, you have to report it out. All the people said that they want the ability not only just talk about active defense, but if they pulled the trigger, then let's just do that. Now what that legal framework looks like on the other slide. But if you don't pull the trigger, still report it out. And this goes towards this notion of distributed intelligence. This goes towards the notions of certs. This goes towards the notions of reporting out transparency. Because the public doesn't trust you, nor do they trust government. And all the participants who came from your industry, by the way, said, don't get us to do it. Well, why not IEEE? Oh, no, not them. Well, what about ICANN? Oh, not them. All right, you guys tell me what you want. We don't know. Well, you want something different. Uh-huh. But you don't know what. Uh-uh. Okay, so this monosyllable conversation gets us nowhere. Right. So I imposed something on them. And I said, well, what about this framework? And what it is, it comes out of a public reporting model that's used in healthcare, that's used in other kind of operations. And they went, oh yeah, we like that one. It's epidemiologically based, medicine based, not IT based, medicine based. Of course, the word virus and worms come back to my echo. Well, do you mean you want a medical monitoring system? No, we just want to be able to dump the data somewhere so that we don't have to see it. Everybody can share it with us. And that's kind of contradiction. So if we go tactically or strategically, there's two different puzzles in there, which I think we're running out of time on. But the interesting part, which again caught me off guard, because this doesn't come out of the literature, it doesn't come out of, it comes out of the actual survey participants. They said that when we go to public reporting, we want it to be legally binding. And that was a bit of a shocker, because up until this point, everybody's been saying, we don't want IT to be bound by any kind of public framework and accountability framework. But you want it somehow. And I think what they were trying to get at, and this is what I explore a little bit later in the literature or in the paper, was I get about this idea of they want to be held accountable by an external standard. Not by the IT industry itself holding itself accountable, but by something outside of it. But not government. Right. There's a problem in there. And I think this is one of the puzzles in given this ubiquitous societies that we're now living in. And finally, the last one is an evaluation instrument. This come out, again, there was some data that says that it can be evaluated ethically and morally and legally. And the notion of harm emerges out of this very, very quickly. So how we measure harm against active defense is a criminal code lethal framework. All right, so last piece. Yeah, no, one more slide. I think we're about there. So the last piece is the decision-making model. Oh, good, 3, we're on time. Is the decision-making model. You'll note that the orange is the corporation, and you'll note that nothing reports to the corporation. This was interesting. I had assumed all along in the research, and assumed, that was one of my core assumptions, hypotheses, that you guys wanted tools for the corporation. Because that's your legal framework you defend yourselves in. That's not what came out. In fact, what came out was they want the individual to have tools to make decisions with to conduct active defense. Not to turn it off or turn it on, but to actually follow through a decision matrices to get to that last point. Because right now, all the guys in that survey are just turning it on. Yeah.
Has there been some corporations, let's use Canada as an example, that have expressed an interest in this?
In this research?
Well, in actually doing it.
Yes. There are quite a few, well, let me rephrase that. Yes, they're interested in it, but what they're more interested in is the rationale they would present to the public that what they did was okay. And I think that's that guilty conscience piece that emerges in some other surveys that I don't present here. I have another whole presentation on the research itself and all the problems in the research we encountered. It was a fascinating puzzle. But they are happening in Canada, by the way. Yes?
So I can see where this could go, is that if you say active defense becomes legal, then there's a business opportunity. your defense industrial complex. You know, guns for hire. You can start selling exploits ready to go and ready to launch.
Absolutely.
Like you move from physical arms to electronic arms. What
And-
would stop us from happening?
Nothing. It's already on the books.
Now you've got an international arms race, Airbus and Boeing, and BAE and Bombardier. You keep going, and then you get all these guys that are writing offensive weapons that are electronic.
Thank you. We've already got it. And that's the problem. So to go back to your arms race, yes, we're in it right now. It's already happening. We've got companies, military industrial complex companies who build weapon systems, Rapiers, Challengers, weapons, Airbus, you name it. They're doing malware designs. They're doing threat assessment models for active warfare. The puzzle, though, and this is the key piece here, in order for active defense to be legal, you have to be a victim first. In order for... I knew. I had to wait. Someone had to go for it. Yeah. No. Okay, so you're talking two problems. I know. I had the same reaction. I went, no, this is BS. There's two puzzles in here. There's puzzles of state, and there's puzzles of individuals. Pearl Harbor was a state-based failure. It was state on state who failed to the U.S., knowing full well its capabilities, had somewhat limited intelligence, admittedly, but they knew enough that there was a problem. Pearl Harbor is often used as an example. The problem with Pearl Harbor is that it's kinetic on kinetic. And state on state had, at that time, state on state had absolute ability to project force. So this is where my social sciences piece kicks in a lot. So the notion of, how are we doing for time? Oh, yeah, this is where the fun gets going. Okay, so there are two concepts that we have to be very, very cognizant of here. One is state-on-state conflict. Russia beats up the crap out of China. China beats the crap out of the Americans. Americans beat the crap out of everybody else. India gets involved in the game. That's state-on-state funded operations. That comes from the ability to conduct war. That war comes from the ability to understand the rules of war. Clausewitz, Sun Tzu, the Geneva Convention, the Armistice Conventions, and other long-type range conventions that allow us stability in warfare. That's state on state. The one that we are concerned with is where we see state failing, and we see what we call the, you guys know this as well as I do, if not better, the ability for a small party who's not state funded can go in and beat the crap out of the state itself. But instead of taking the state head on, which is war or guerrilla warfare, there's a slide here I do not have. I wish I did now because we could have that conversation. 5 generations of warfare have occurred in society. There are 5 of them. We are in the top of the 5th right now. We're in the space where we've seen society fail because the government can't project its force in a systematic, orderly way. So the first kind of warfare, a bunch of clubs beat the crap out of each other. Second warfare, we lined up a few bombs and grenades. Third warfare, the Gatling gun showed up. 4th level showed up, and what we have is the Gatling gun now being owned by private individuals to go conduct guerrilla operations. So that's guerrilla states fighting against government to replace government. 5th generation warfare is a little bit different, and that's where we are right now. And there's a lot of material to back this up. This 5th generation problem arose out of the research I was doing, where I started asking the question was, is this war? Is active defense a state of war? And if you're state on state beating the crap out of each other, yes it is. But that's offensive operations. That's defined by a convention of rules of order. This is different. This is where the individuals and the corporations who are victims of a crime have the ability to project force back. And the puzzle that I'm dealing with when we talk about this, and this another whole puzzle, is if this is what we're going to do, and government has shirked its responsibility, and citizens can't trust the government and can't trust corporations, then you're going to see a guerrilla level type operation occurring. 36% of our public do not trust government, and about 20% don't trust corporations. That's no surprise. Go ahead.
I want to ask the people in this room, do you think our federal government has the ability to defend our businesses from cyber attack?
No.
And you're telling me I can't take it into my own hands?
Yes.
Okay.
You want the rest of the answer?
Yeah.
What's the next question? There's another question there. So the third question, if the government can't do it and the state can't do it, then the corporations have to do it. And if the corporations have to do it, then that means we've got to go and actively write, and this is where you guys get on the ball. Okay, this is where you guys start to make the decision whether or not you want this or not. Because if you want it, you're going to get it stuffed down your throat. The government's going to do it. The public's going to force this game. You can see the two previous bills were forced. So here's what's going to happen. If this is going to work right, and we're going to keep this thing together and keep our information world together, and actually protect each one of you individuals, and this is where I start to get just a little bit elevated. So I have a boss that says to me when I'm elevated, I'm up here somewhere, I got to get back down here. But the problem being is that we wouldn't ask this question. What software and hardwares and ethical rules do we need to train our citizens to take responsibility for their identity? That's the question. Because we're always saying, let the corporations do it. That's how the law is written. We're always saying the government has the mandate to deal with this. Yes, but look at the privacy laws. You're responsible for your privacy. You're responsible for your rules and regulations of sharing information. You're responsible, and yet there's nothing in the books that allows a legal framework to go, you screwed with my data, I'm going to come talk to you. There's nothing. The CRTC says you can't do that. The criminal code says you can't do that. There's another piece of legislation I'm looking at very carefully in the Transport Act. You can't touch certain systems. Okay, I get that. Then you're telling me then information itself is the worst, is actually up for anybody's grab. The vigilantes are going to come into the game plan. To give you an idea what this means, and it's morbid, okay, guys? It's the death penalty. I know. How does the death penalty get into this game plan? So there was a conversation around vigilantism, death penalty, whether or not the state should be involved in death penalties. Well, that was dealt with. It was wrong for the citizen to conduct death penalties because you had a sheriff. But those rules and those frameworks of corporal bodies and material world measurements don't translate very well into cyber policy. Moving forward, I think what has to happen is the industry itself has to get off the fence and deal with the reality that you're getting hammered. You're constantly being gutted out. And if this is in a corporate world and someone told me that my system is being stolen every day, I'd be on a bit of a rant. That's probably why I don't work in some of your offices and go, what are you doing? Go, so one last thought on this one. I said I can get going on this one in a hurry. That's where a bulk of my research ended up going, by the way, is actually trying to figure out how to get to that space of let's do something right, or something about it at least, or try. Go ahead.
Have you looked at investigating the changes to criminal code which would allow key infrastructure corporations or entities to protect themselves because they're protecting the general public?
Right. So I did, and then I stopped. I worked with a couple lawyers to try and figure out what that would look like. And what came up was this funny little puzzle. It was, let's do it. Let's change the law and make you 100% corporately responsible. So I will make you legally 100% accountable in the books. But the question becomes is how do I measure that level of accountability? And in the insurance industry, this is where we saw an example where the insurance industry sort of got it right, and you go, okay. So now we're putting insurance, we've always had this insurance policy for network securities and privacy breaches and things like that. What's insurance? Shifting the risk from us onto an insurance broker. And we just pay out a fine or pay out insurance fees. We actually don't start solving the problem until the insurance industry turns around and says, no, you're 100% on the hook for it. You fix this problem and we'll reduce your premiums and incentivize it. But in terms of actually trying to find policy position, we would have to bring the war measures legislation and bring down the civil liabilities legislation and bring it down into the criminal code and make it a legal remedy for you to conduct active defense based upon this criteria. And the criteria used, just so you're, damn, we're running out of time, aren't we? In another deck, I have a criteria book which says when active defense is launched, you have to follow the Criminal Code of Canada's criteria rules for lethal force and harms inflicted. Harms inflicted comes out of healthcare ethics. Harms inflicted comes out of managing risk of persons dying because of negligence. So those frames exist. And someone said to me, and I don't know if it was in this meeting or another meeting, I heard this comment, is that malware itself actually has levels of harm attached to it. And I've now found some research, and this is where I'm starting to go. My next piece of paper is I want to look at, can you codify levels of harm based upon sophistication of the technology? And this comes out of a piece of other research, and again, another space. So social sciences, we get to start to put pieces together and allows us to do methodological meta-modeling. In healthcare, when they started talking about disease and death rates and mortality and morbidity rates, they built frameworks around kinds of diseases. There's nothing stopping us from doing this in health within IT, because one of the things that I've learned about talking to some of you folks is that as you design malware, you design intent into it. Once you design intent into it, ethically, I've got a hook on you. That's where ethics comes in. Because now I can go, how much harm did you intend to cause by the code you wrote? And how much harm did you inflict by the cause? But I can also nail you on negligence of harm. First degree versus second degree versus accidental deaths. Accidental death, you didn't mean to kill the poor guy. Well, I just pointed the car, I'm scared him. Second degree, no, I actually meant to kill him, but not that way. Oops, sorry, killed him the wrong way. Homicide, first degree. I formed the intent, I formed the weapon, I formed the stalking, I formed the predatory behavior, I formed the model for kill, I killed. No different than anything else. In healthcare, we have the same effect on doctors. So there are models that exist. The question is, how well does it fit? That's the puzzle. Talking stick.
So the models you talked about, whether it's healthcare or protection or legal frameworks around the world, they're all different because you're geographically isolated. Whereas in this world, this is the great equalizer, because malware can be written by anybody in the world and be affected by anyone else in the world. So how do you expect nations to converge on any solution? And we're talking about Canada and the US here, but the companies and the individuals work for any corporation on the world. So who exactly are we talking about as a corporation here?
Everybody around the world. I used to believe that argument until I started looking at psychological profiling. So when we do profiling on any offender, caveat, I have to be careful here. I am not a profiler by trade. I work with profiler teams, so when we go looking for targets or individuals that we know are offenders, we hire professionals to work with us. I take their intel sets and I use that. From that, I make my tactical decision. I go find my person and apprehend and carry out a warrant. Or carry it in effect, sorry, could be in a warrant. In your case, I used to believe that also until I started reading papers about hackers who were interviewed around the world. And believe it or not, culture played a big role. Motivations played a big role. How they write their code is sentimentality and sentient modeling based upon human behavior. So I don't believe anymore in that argument. That was one of my high horses that I wanted to live on because it made sense. I believe that technology flattens the world. It doesn't. It actually reinforces. Technology is an echo chamber that actually hammers and reinforces cultural normative behaviors and cultural normative coding. It's quite intriguing. Yes, sir.
So right now there's pretty active case that's being played out in the United States. Involves like Robert Mueller's indictment of most recently 13 Russians involved with the interference with the Russian U.S. elections, and also there was 3 named corporations.
Yes.
3 Russian corporations. So from my understanding that one of the corporations, Internet Research Agency, has actually brought in U.S. lawyers to actually fight this, and was more of a tactic. I guess they were abusing the United States discovery laws in the sense that they were taking that information and they're sending it back to Homeland, and they're trying to discredit the Mueller investigation out of this.
Yeah.
So I guess in this case, is it state on state, or like who gets involved with something like that?
So that's state on state, because again, caveat, there's an indictment that's going to be released that will explain more. But when you have the state funding the actor's behavior, and the state has the absolute ability to control you, that is state on state conflict. And we go back to 1906. Like, we can go back to 1906. We can go back to 2000 or to 1840s. How far back in history do you want to go, where state has moles and inserts and transplants waiting to be turned? The Romans did it. The French did it. The Syrians, Genghis Khan did it. Everybody does it. That's war. That's part of being in a war. That's part of a declared states, undeclared states, of state-on-state warfare. This is a bit funny because what we're trying to say here, and Mr. Putin's very good at distancing himself from those actors. His problem, though, is that he's got 2 books published. You ever want to get your head rattled a bit, go read these books. Because they talk about information doctrine as a state-based activity, not as the sole company activity. Russian companies don't run independent of state. Just call a mule what it is. It's a mule. Okay? And this is one of the conversations I have with people going, will you stop being politically nice about this? Because they're getting hammered. Those guys are Russian actors who are funded by the state for the purpose of subverting the government of the United States in an electoral process. That's subversion and espionage, period. The fact that they manipulated the systems through fake news, information modeling, that's a different puzzle. There's a report that's come out just recently, and this is where I posted and said the details are in the fine print. There's a report from the U.S. Senate, one of those committees. U.S. has it says that there was no material harm or effect on the U.S. electoral system. Thank you very much. In other words, what you're saying is that the hacker didn't get inside and hack your system and change your voting counts. Right. But I had 2 years to run an information campaign against you to tell you how bad Miss Clinton was. Right. But that's not a material effect against the electoral system. And this is where I get into that headbanging argument with folks going, pay attention to what's being said, but ask the critical question, what part of the system are they reporting on? In the IT professions, we often report, and again, you guys are fascinating people, by the way, so please don't, I know it feels like I'm probably dumping, going, oh my God, what's this guy doing? But one of the fascinating things you guys are really good at is compartmentalizing. And you can compartmentalize, that's how you write your code, that's how you manage products, that's how you manage service to market, ... But that's what the bad guys do and count on, that you do that and consistently over and over again. And when you talk about the threats and you talk about ethics and harms, you compartmentalize them. And as a result, there's no whole picture. And I kept going back to my survey participants and asked them this question, something along that line there. Can you see all of the harm? Well, nobody can. Really? Nobody wants to sit down and look for all the harm. Nobody wants to build out. So the harm model, I don't know if I got it in this one or not. Oh God, 4 o'clock already. Oh God, I gotta get one down. I'll wrap this up really very quickly. So in terms of ethics and legalities, ethics argues that there's this problem in larger societies. The legal framework can't catch up because you guys are changing the goalposts so much. Now, as a result of this, though, this is the indictment that was just released recently, and last year, sorry. I love it because that's the dam that got hacked. It's about 6 feet tall. This is the one that we're supposed to hit. It's not 6 feet tall. Apparently they named, so the bad guys named the right, sort of had the right name of the dam, but the wrong location, and hit this one in New York, because everybody wants to blow New York up. Now, the problem here was that when the indictment was released, they actually named this dam in the indictment, which they had to, and then they told them what the servers and SCADAs look like. Thank you. Madam Justice, can I come and have a talk with you, please? Can't talk to justice like that, they get upset. But apparently this is what they had to do, full disclosure. No, they didn't. They could have done a voir dire on it, shut it down. This one, we all know this from the health services in England. Why this is so problematic was how blasé the media handled it. I worked in healthcare. There's an expression here, and we used to call it the rack and stack effect, and that if you see more than 4 wagons, ambulance crews sitting out front, you got problems. We were counting 15, 20, 30, 40. Oh, we stopped counting because we couldn't keep up. Now, apparently only 3 people died. Right. And we don't want to report this, by the way. The redacted report that came out is so heavily redacted, we actually don't know what the problem looks like. And finally, of course, we know this guy, Mr. Stuxnet, and how it blew up. The ethics behind that one was very straightforward. I will name them. It was Americans, and it was Israeli. You can read all the papers. And then finally, the last one. So state-based, private-based. State-based, private-based. This is a private guy who did this. The lesson to take away, folks, is that as we talk about the ethics issues, it's going to affect all of us across the state and across the individuals. And you guys are stuck in the middle. You're actually caught between a rock and a hard place. And that's it, folks. Yeah, there's our contact information. Thank you so much for your patience and time. See, now we can ask questions anymore.
Well, does anyone have any final questions before we head out for this?
It's 4:06. Come on.
Yeah, everything that I heard today just reminds me. So I'm a big on folklore. Back in the '80s, there was a TV show called Cheers. Does anybody remember that show?
Yeah.
So in the show, it's about a bar called Cheers, a corporation. Corporation was in the business of providing a social space for people. So the people who were private citizens there, we can see them almost like stakeholders. So they had a rival bar called Gary's Old Time Taverns, and every couple episodes they'd have a thing where they would play pranks on each other's. Go into the whole thing, like attacks. And sometimes they were willful participants, and they wanted to fight back. Other times they weren't, and every episode something would happen where Gary's Old Time Tavern would win, and Cheers would be shamed, and it happened again and again and again and again. And the whole thing is with Cheers is they failed, the staff at Cheers and the barflies at Cheers, they failed in a good active attack strategy. So on the final season, which was the best, was arguably one of the best seasons on TV, they got this guy, and it was like a parody of what happened back in the 1920s when somebody tried to con somebody into buying that the Eiffel Tower was going to be torn down, and they were going to buy the scrap. They did something similar to that, where they brought out this guy who was a local card shark who would sometimes go to the bar, and they got Gary and tricked him in the process of putting on this prank that he would sell his bar and bulldoze it down to rezone it to build it into something better, and then that was a form of active attack, where they got him to willfully destroy himself in the hope that in destroying himself, he would somehow magnanimously make himself, beat Cheers once and for all. So they played on his desire like that, and after he was completely obliterated, that Gary's Old Town Tavern existed, he was no longer there, able to attack Cheers. So that's where the parallels of everything that went in here is. So I think that that when you have what motivates, what is the budget for how much someone's willing to be putting into an active attack, it was all based on contagion, not of the public, not of the corporation. The corporate, which was serving its stakeholders, which it was only accountable to its customers. It was within the contagion of their interest based on how many drinks they were buying at the bar, of how far they were willing to react. And that could kind of like set a framework of what kind of budget you can put in for active defense. And it always went to the point of where it ended up being entertaining, where the whole morality of what was going too far kind of, I think that was the episode where, they had to, where the staff from Cheers had to lost a bet and they had to dance naked or something. So back to the whole thing is when the show ended and Gary's bar was down, and back to the whole thing where Sam no longer felt actualized because he no longer had that rivalry or that prank no more. There was the whole ethical dilemma and the whole ethical debate that happened at the end of the bar, and it was exactly what we all talked about today.
Interesting, thank you.
Yeah. So what's the answer then?
That's the, you gotta watch that episode and got it right, that's it.
And I'll hand it back to Rob.
That's where I get cranked up going, no, you can't stop it. Because that's what happened when they stopped me in the series ended. You can't think like that.
Okay, the ethical response to this scenario is don't do active defense while intoxicated.
Damn, that was one survey question I should have asked.
Oh, is there any other final questions, comments? All right, awesome. Can we get a round of applause for our two speakers today? Thank you so much, Rob and Patrick. So we'll see you guys. It won't be next month, I believe, because we're off for B-sides, maybe? April? April, yeah. Okay, so we'll see you in April, and thanks so much for coming out today.